Welcome to the India Energy Hour, where we explore the biggest questions shaping energy transitions, climate action, and sustainable development in India and beyond. Your hosts for this episode are Shreya Jay, energy writer and policy analyst, and Dr. Sandeep Pai, energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. If you enjoy listening to the India Energy Hour, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. India's energy transition is unfolding against a backdrop of geopolitical uncertainty, volatile energy markets, and growing electricity demand. How should India navigate these competing pressures? In this episode, we are joined by Bill Spindle, a journalist who spent decades at the Wall Street Journal, covering global finance, conflicts in West Asia, and later the global energy transition. We examine how regional conflicts are reshaping India's energy security. We also discuss the evolving role of coal and renewables and why India's energy choices could determine the success of the global clean energy transition.
Bill, thank you so much for joining and thank you so much for doing this. Very excited to talk to you about India's energy transition in the context of global energy transition and also in the context of what's happening in West Asia right now. So thank you for joining.
Thank you, Sandeep. I'm a huge fan of the show. It's just a thrill to be able to be on here with you.
Okay, wonderful. So as our tradition goes, let's start with you. Where were you born? What did you study? How did you become a journalist, and how did you specifically then started working on energy climate issues? So let's go down that rabbit hole of decades of your work.
Sure, it's a long tail at this point. So I grew up in Michigan, in a town called Grand Rapids, and I uh, basically started working at the college newspaper, which got me into journalism, which then sort of got me working in local journalism, mostly in Michigan at first. Just covered the police beat and local government and that sort of thing. But I always wanted to go abroad, and I sort of got my chance a couple of years later when my wife needed to go to Japan for her PhD research. She's a Japanese art historian. So I went to Japan without a job, found a job there, and started kind of working as a journalist. And the story in Japan in the 1990s was really a business story. So I covered the auto industry for a while for Business Week magazine. And then the financial story in Japan really became the big story. The bubble had burst in the late 80s, very early 90s. And I really covered the financial industry, first for Bloomberg and then Wall Street Journal as the financial sector sort of imploded through the 1990s. That sort of got me at the Wall Street Journal, and it kind of embedded there. I got a job, an opportunity to be the assistant foreign editor in New York in early 2001. I moved to New York. We moved into the financial district. The Wall Street Journal's offices were in the financial district. And 4 months later, 9/11 happened. We were blown out of both our offices and our apartment. And I, at the Journal, got pulled into organizing kind of the overseas coverage of the aftermath of 9/11. And that got me very focused on the Middle East, West Asia in our context here today, Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq, all that. So for about 15 years, I really covered and oversaw reporters working in West Asia mostly, as well as some of those other areas. And really it was all wars and terrorism and uprisings through the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS. It was really a tumultuous period where I mostly focused on those sorts of things. A lot of conflict reporting. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Syria during the civil wars and the invasion of Iraq there. And that sort of, I did that for, gosh, like 15 years, until like 2014, 15, when I just decided I really needed a break from all that. And the journal, the Wall Street Journal, was really terrific and gave me the opportunity to cover energy on a global basis. They basically said it was sort of a dream job. They sort of said, go anywhere in the world and write about anything you want as long as it has to do with energy. And this was the time that the rise of the shale boom in the U.S., the unconventional oil drilling that had really turned the global oil industry on its head. The market had collapsed the year before. All the attention was on sort of OPEC and the oil sector. But I also started to look at renewable energy a little bit in that period. So I did that for about a year or so. Well, almost 2 years, really, in the end. And the opportunity came up to move to India. The Wall Street Journal was looking for a South Asia bureau chief based in India. So I jumped at the chance to do that. I had when we were living in West Asia, I had I've been all over the Middle East, but we had lived most of the time in Abu Dhabi, so in the Gulf. And surprisingly, I had not spent a lot of time in India. So this was a great chance to do that. And so I moved to India, based partly, kind of split our time between Mumbai and Delhi, did a lot of traveling. And that was kind of in the 2015 time period. And the first conversation I had, although as the South Asia bureau chief, we were covering everything. And I had a bureau of 6 or 7 reporters and myself. And, India is a big, broad story, as you know, in both economics, politics, security, international affairs. The whole shebang is what we covered. But the first conversation I had when I got there was I sat down with the minister, Piyush Goyal, who at the time was the minister of, I'm remembering the exact title, I think it was, I have it written down here. What is it? Minister of Power, Coal, and New and Renewable Energy. So I sat down with him. This is 2015. And we basically had a conversation about coal. There was very little discussion of renewable energy or anything. It was really about how India's future really still depended largely on coal. There was a lot of plans to expand coal capacity. And when I asked him about renewable energy and that stuff, he said, well, that stuff's great. We would love to expand into it, but it's really too expensive. The price is coming down, but the financing costs are still, exorbitant, especially if you're trying to get capital from overseas. So we're really going to spend a lot of time on coal. So that was interesting. I kind of moved on. We did a lot of other things. I paid a little attention to energy. I wound up leaving India around the beginning of COVID. And then I wound up leaving the Wall Street Journal about a year after that in COVID. And I decided I really wanted to focus on energy transition and climate issues going forward. So the first thing I did was think about going back to India, because I really felt that India was a really underplayed energy story. China was getting a lot of attention. Of course, America was getting a lot of attention, of course, but a lot hadn't been written about India. And India, just is such a critical country in terms of the broader global energy transition, simply because that is where the growth, as you well know, of energy demand is going to come from over the next half century. And both in India itself and broadly that developing economy, that India can play such a big role in kind of setting a course for or helping contribute to. So I got a grant from the Council on Foreign Relations and set about a train trip through India. That was a little bit crazy. I wound up traveling 8,500 kilometers all around India over 6 solid months. uh, on the train, on the Indian railways, going to various places and stopping and looking at both climate issues, climate impacts within India, which are, as you all well know, and your listeners well know, are now becoming quite pronounced. And then on the other hand, energy transition, sort of all the different ways energy transition was playing out in India. So that was this just incredible trip. Even though I'd lived in India for 4 previous years and really traveled pretty extensively, it was something else to just take it all in one long trip. I started in the Sundarbans, looking at some of the climate impacts there. I traveled through Kolkata, then all the way across the country. I looked at the politics and sort of social effects of electricity in the discoms in Uttar Pradesh. I went across to Rajasthan and Gujarat and looked at solar, some of the largest solar plants in the world there. I went way out in the Thar Desert to look at a gargantuan solar farm. I looked at stopped in Surat and looked at a solar manufacturing operation that was getting set up, Goldie. Then went down the coast to Goa, looked at kind of coal importing port that was being built in Goa. I went around then, all the way around to Odisha and Jharkhand, areas I know you've looked at pretty extensively, and went out and looked at some of the coal area, where the coal is actually being mined, and some of the social issues around coal dependence. We could talk about some of that. And then I went way out to Manipur to look at rural electrification. I visited the last little town that the Modi government sort of said, this is it. We've connected this town up, and that's the last town to connect. And really looked at India's both the huge progress it made in the 5 years since I had talked with Piyush Goyal and arrived in India on kind of rural electrification, and yet the challenges that still lay ahead in really fully electrifying these areas and bringing energy to it. And then finally, I was kind of looking at the Indian Railway itself, which is such a fabulous example of what a knotty social, political challenge actual energy transition is. Here's a railway that on one level is entirely succeeded, right? It's fully electrified. I think something like 98% of passenger kilometers are now electrified. But at the same time, that whole Indian railway structure rests on what? On the single largest and most profitable freight class, which is coal. So when you try to pull coal out of the system, yes, you can pull it out of the railway and electrify it, but that doesn't really decarbonize the railway if most of the electricity is coming from coal. And when you try to pull the coal out of the electricity system, once again, that will redound eventually to the railway. And of course, all the ways the railway provides services to the Indian people, all of whom are voters and don't, it's just a very good example of how knotty and complicated a full-scale decarbonization and energy transition is. So that sort of brings us, to today, more or less. I finished that trip in India, and then I've spent the last years after that. I kind of took that same model, like go to a country, look at energy transition, look at climate impacts. I've sort of taken that global and tried to. So I've been to Australia, I've been to Japan, I've been to Patagonia, both Argentina and Chile. I've been to Europe, and I've spent quite a bit of time in the U.S., especially Texas, looking at all the ways that energy transition is playing out in all these different places. And it kind of all started there in India.
Amazing. One question I have, because you have such a vast experience covering from US to India, everything in between. Um, do policymakers in US, especially in the energy space, if from your vantage point, do you think they understand India? Do you think they appreciate what's going on in India? Because one thing that is sort of I always notice is when it comes to issues in the US or even in Europe or in some other countries that are more familiar, to some degree, even China, people are very nuanced. But when it comes to India, it's all either it's coal or all renewables. Like it just swings. But it's very binary in nature rather than like you're talking about Texas. It's much more nuanced than people think. It's not just about. I mean, it's one of the
Yeah.
largest wind states in the country. So from your point of view, I think the kind of work you have done hopefully helps people in the West and at large others understand like how complex these issues are. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on has that understanding increased or is it the same or has it
Yeah.
changed?
Yeah, I think, one of the big America, I'm a proud American, and America has many, many strengths and many, many positive attitudes and things about it. But I think one thing that's always difficult for Americans and American government often to get their heads around is to try to look at the rest of the world from its own perspective rather than sort of from a U.S. perspective of U.S. interests or even just U.S. centric view of the world. So I think you had many years through Obama and Biden, to some extent, approaching India like, why can't you just get on board with this climate thing and get rid of your coal and start using renewables exclusively? And India always had to respond. Look, we have 1.4 billion people here. We cannot. Many of them are very poor. Many of them have no energy access at all, and a large number of them have insufficient energy access by a long shot. So we have to think about that, and we've really got to put development first and foremost, and that puts limitations on how fast we can move, especially to the extent there's a trade-off between, say, using coal in the short term to keep the lights on, to keep the factories moving, to keep the economy going, and these longer term renewable energy. If there's a trade-off there, well, we're going to have to work with that trade-off. And then I think more recently, you've seen the Trump administration come in from the opposite direction and sort of like, why, just buy our LNG, get our oil, get on board with our oil. And India, I think, to some extent, saying, well, we do need those things. We need them at a affordable price. But we also are pretty committed to this renewable energy thing in the long term, and we really do need and will continue to focus on that because, of course, India's government needs to look out for the welfare and the security of the Indian people. So I think it's that's the difficulty, I think, often from the American perspective.
And thank you for doing all the work you do to help policymakers understand a little bit more of the nuance.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, to the extent I can, that's what I've really tried to do is go to places. First, India, but not exclusively, but go to places and really try to tell the story from the perspective of that place to try to give, all of the people who read my Substack and where I write for other places, but to give them a sense of a place and ground the story in that place and often from the perspective of the people in that place, their needs, their hopes, their desires.
That's great. I want to move on to the topic that I want to discuss with you, which is really like the focus, everything that's going on in the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz and between Iran, US, and Israel. So I wanted to understand that in the context of this, the geopolitics of the conflict and the way energy markets are being reshaped and shaped. From your perspective, how significant is this time in terms of reshaping the energy security narrative or realignment of energy security? What that means for different countries, not just India, but I want to start more big picture and then, go to India. So are we going to see some big shifts as a result of this conflict and realignment? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we are. I think this is a real one of these once in a generation, maybe even more than that, flex points in the way kind of energy and geopolitics intersect around the world. I think this is a big deal, particularly for two reasons. Where it happened. It happened in the Persian Gulf. And that was really, the Persian Gulf has been the foundational place in for energy markets around the world, particularly oil. But oil is the biggest market, and it's sort of the quintessential tradable uh, commodity around the world. And really, for whatever reason, though some questioned it on the fringes, generally people accepted the Persian Gulf as sort of rock solid producers. These, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, they were always, oil was going to come from that region. It's going to be reliable. There were some ructions in the 70s that were probably the last big flex point in energy. But since then, there's been a real effort on the part of the Gulf countries and broadly the organization they play such a big role in, OPEC, to keep oil, in a sustainable, reliable range so that the world could rely on it, rock solid. Again, Qatar played that role, in particular in the LNG markets. Qatari long-term LNG contracts that extended over decades, that really were considered rock solid. Like you can count on this. This has thrown all of that up in the air. Qatar has not been able to deliver through no fault of its own, really, but cannot deliver on its contracts for 2 months now. It's going to be years till some of those trains, those LNG production trains that were damaged in the war, come back again. And also just, ultimately oil is going to flow through the Gulf, through the Strait of Hormuz, that little channel that kind of through which almost all of the Gulf oil has to go. It'll flow again, but I think it's going to be a very long time, if ever, that the world, countries like India that are big importers, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, big oil importers in the world. It's just, the lesson from this has been that foundation has really been fundamentally shaken. And then the other big deal about this particular crisis, I think, is the timing, when it's happened. And one big part about that timing is it came 2 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which caused a similar giant spike in energy prices. Not quite, I wouldn't say it shook the foundations of the energy system like this one has, but it too was a reminder to many countries, India above almost all of them, that these imported products are not fundamentally reliable. You may need them, but they're really not reliable, and you need to search for other alternatives. And that's the other big thing about the timing here is this crisis, even compared to the Ukraine crisis just 3-4 years ago, 5 years ago now, the alternatives are really out there these days. There's a lot more to choose from. India's been availing itself of lots of that. Wind, renewables, batteries, just in the last 18 months have really come down. There's lots of new work, a lot of it being done in India about how to integrate all this together. So the alternatives now are there. So I think, that the 1970s oil crises really shook up the developed world, the OECD nations at the time. They really made big changes after that in energy efficiency, in pushing oil out of the power sector. Really, changes that took decades. They took a long time, but they were triggered by that. And I think that this crisis will be that sort of 70s style crisis, but for the emerging countries and the developing economies that are so on the cusp of India, on the cusp, growing quite quickly, and really on the cusp of long-term sustainable growth, but also vulnerable. And I think the lesson long-term was already really understood, I think, very well in Indian policy circles, and really the Indian people, I think, as well, that we've got to find a way to get beyond this. It's not easy. It's maybe gone, I wouldn't say slow by any stretch of the imagination, but but I think there's going to be a redoubling down that we're on the right path and we need to stay on this path and find ways to speed it up. And the great news is there's lots of ways to speed it up. So it's that kind of crisis. I think it's really important, particularly for India and the developing countries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And but I want to push back a little bit just for the sake of argument.
Sure.
Because India is also endowed with coal, um, this is the moment where you could. I don't think, India is going down China's path. That's not happening. But it's a question of, you have a pathway, and India's, energy demand is growing like no other, as you said. Um, so you could have taken the entire new demand using renewables. Uh, but now this kind of crisis means, is there a possibility that coal will see a shoot up in production and use even for the next 5 or 10 years? I'm not talking long term, but I think is given. But what is your thought? And do you see that as a wider trend, not just in India, but any country we hear news about, Italy saying, we're going to prolong our power plants, South Korea, Indonesia, all these other kind of
The
coal
Trump
sort of,
administration here in the US.
and Trump administration wants to sell more coal to India, right? Saying like, take away our coal, we have big, beautiful coal. So given everything that's going on, do you think there is a tendency that, okay, let's do both, and maybe, in the short and medium term, coal could see a rise. I'm not going to say it will take over, but it will see a little bit more uptick. What's your
Yeah.
thought based on your experience?
Yeah, I think that's not just a possibility, but a likelihood. I think in many countries that you have to use what's available. Japan is lifted some of the limits it had on coal generation. I do think, as before, the Indian government's responsibility, as all governments' responsibility, is for the welfare and security of its own people. So, to the extent that coal needs to be used in the short term to keep the lights on, to keep things going, that's likely to see an uptick there. Um, However, I think that's where these new alternatives really come in. Is depending on what you define as the short term, the medium term, and the long term, right? Energy is a long, long game. So, I'm not quite sure how many years you put on the short term and where the medium term starts. But, you know, the there is no question, I don't think, IRENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, put out a report last year showing how much progress has been made in driving down the cost, not just of renewable energy like wind and solar, but also the cost of putting them together in a systemic way with storage, whether that's battery storage or many times in India, it's pumped hydro storage. That the cost of those systems has just dropped so dramatically that they're really, it's hard to believe that in the medium term, you're going to build a lot more coal plants. I think there's some stuff in the pipeline. My guess is even all the stuff in the pipeline is not going to be built. But when you pencil the numbers out of like, does it make sense to build a new coal plant or build some sort of renewable system that can provide really the same sort of base load in many places? And India has some of the best resources in the world. Um, I think increasingly the decision is always going to be let's go with these new technologies, and that still leaves a huge challenge of what to do about the existing coal and how to eventually, ramp up these other systems so much that you can begin ramping down coal. But I think in somewhere between the short and the long term, it's just going to be obvious, and I think India is very on board with this idea that we're going to move towards these less expensive, cleaner technologies that provide a lot more security because we're producing the energy here at home.
And so fast forward maybe a few years from now, maybe 2028, 2029. let's say there is a change of guard in the US and a Democrat administration comes here, and then it'll all possibly will become why coal, right? Get rid of coal. So if you were advising a policymaker in India, what would be your advice? Because you can anticipate that happening. I remember during the Biden administration when, John Kerry and others used to go to India, they would start by pretty much saying like, why coal, which you were referring to. So if we take this conflict, take it like 3 years from now, and, India will obviously, like you said, like perhaps not build something new, but perhaps complete some of the things or try to complete some of the things which are in the pipeline. But taking a 5-year view from here, which is, from until 2030, and if there is a change of guard in US, which will go back to more climate friendly administration, how would you advise Indian policymaker in terms of their messaging, in terms of their, planning for another upheaval in terms of the signaling around energy systems?
Well, I think the Indian policymakers do not need my advice on this particular topic because because my advice is exactly what they very well know how to do, which is say, we're going to do what's best for India and for the Indian people. But increasingly, the answer to that is going to be how can we, first and foremost, get off all these imported products that are causing us, so much, costing us so much money. And that I think, we haven't quite talked about this, but it's not just oil and LNG that comes out of the Gulf, right? It's fertilizer and the ingredients to it. And that is, there we're talking not just it's really expensive, and India just had to make a monstrously expensive purchase of fertilizer recently to make sure that there was enough on hand. But really involves the safety and the actual survival of people. It's food we're talking about. So, I think they don't need my advice to tell them what they already know, which is we're going to do the best thing for India. But I think that, again, the key is the response to that's going to be, what does that mean for us going forward? Certainly, even in the short term, really, but certainly in the medium term and long term, solar plus storage, nuclear. Yesterday, CEEW, the NGO that does really fine work in the energy sector there in India, and a group called Project Interspace released a big report on geothermal possibilities, and very encouraging report about the possibility of expanding geothermal in India. India is making, I think, has a special place in kind of green hydrogen. Has been, an area everybody was very excited about a couple of years ago, are generally a lot less excited about now. But I think India is one of the countries that I think has got a place for that, and can really, make that work conceivably, and perhaps as an exportable product. But again, there they can generate some of the inputs, for example, that could replace imported gas as an input to make fertilizer, and use it again for security reasons. So there's all these new possibilities, and I think the key for India really is going to be, look, we're broadly rethinking our own energy sector over the long term. That's the second big leg in our energy transition, as and I'm speaking in the voice of an Indian policymaker here, but they're basically saying, look, we've done the first step. We've vastly expanded solar, wind. We're starting to use storage, but the next big leg of this, of course, is trying to broadly integrate all of this into a transformed energy system, which involves a lot of big investments in grids and in storage structures. And my guess is they would then tell any U.S. policymakers that were urging them to get off coal faster that, well, we would love some help financing these pretty steep upfront investments that will then allow us to, grow our renewable and clean energy sector much more. I mean, as you probably know, that India's shedding a huge amount, just throwing away a huge amount of renewable energy, solar energy that's being developed, that's being generated on a daily basis, simply because it doesn't have like many countries are in this spot, Europe as well, around the world. They've built out so much renewable capacity that now the challenge is like, how do we use it all where it's needed at the time it's needed? And that's my guess is what they'll be telling any future U.S. administrations or European or whoever that's coming to them and saying, "Hey, we'd like you to use a lot less coal." The challenge here is the upfront investment needed to integrate all this into a much bigger system that works for us as Indians.
Right. Great. I wanted to keep for a minute on the topic of the conflict and the consequences. So one thing we explored a little bit about was the future of coal in relation to the conflict and what happens in the short and medium term. Second, we also explored about messaging and how it could change because you have so much experience in journalism and messaging and storytelling. But I wanted to ask, is there any other long-term consequence as a result of conflict beyond the two things we discussed? Um, when it comes to countries like India, not necessarily only India, like, do you think this could lead to, more like more suspicion on certain countries or regions? Do you think it will lead to more energy deals between different countries? I don't know. I'm just making it up. So basically, I wanted to ask you: are there any other consequences as a result of this context
Yeah, I do think.
conflict? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think as if you sort of accept the premise that I laid out, which is I believe this is a real historic flex point, a real turning point that's going to change the dynamics going forward. Then, of course, there are first order effects and second order effects and third order effects. And I think once you sort of get beyond the first order impact, which is just a scramble to assure that we've got the energy you need to meet the needs of the country as best you possibly can. Then, the second order effect is, well, how do we then make sure this doesn't happen again? That means really restructuring with the kind of energy system you've got. And then the third order effect from that is, well, okay, how do we do that? What do we need to do? And I think for India, one of the big challenges is how do we make that work both in terms of delivering the energy we need, but also delivering the jobs we need, delivering the economic development we need. And there, the issues do get tougher because, you like many countries, you could just say, hey, well, let's just import everything from China. Because that could be really fast. We just get it in the country, get it up and going. And that's what many countries have done, including India, really, at the beginning of its energy transition. But increasingly, I think India is saying, look, we can't just do that. We got to build industries on this. And there's been a huge amount of progress. I visited that solar plant in Surat, and they were building out a new factory where they were starting with module development. They're now doing quite a bit of that as India's made a lot of progress on module assembly, and now they'll try to move down some of the cells and some of those factories. India's made a huge amount of progress in sort of electrifying its three-wheel and two-wheel mobility sector. As that gets into cars, I think India's going to have to make difficult, but in many ways promising type changes in how it looks at and the toughest one for everybody, particularly India, is China. How do you take advantage of what China has to offer, which is a huge supply of a lot of clean technology, potentially a great source of knowledge for how to build these things and investment for building factories in India, perhaps. So I think that's a big challenge going forward that India's going to have to work with and try to figure out how can we take advantage of not just Chinese products, but Chinese know-how. The U.S. went through a long stage in the 80s and 90s with automobiles where the Japanese, really outran the U.S. industry in a big way. We sort of convinced / forced the Japanese to open manufacturing and not just assembly plants in the U.S., but to start bringing the supply chains and made, the Japanese really have set up entire auto industry ecosystems in whole new parts of the US. In some sense, that knowledge they brought revived not just the Japanese companies operating manufacturing in the US, but they forced the US companies to get much more serious about how they manufactured, save those interests. So I think those are possibilities for India. That's tough, right? India and China have had a rocky relationship in many ways. On the other hand, India imports a ton of stuff from China. So I think that's an area that's tricky, but very promising if India could figure out a way to get into those supply chains and then become a part of a global network that clearly China is helping build out in clean energy, and become a key manufacturer for many countries, not just for India itself, but for many countries who are uncomfortable importing at the levels they would need to. They don't have the ability to manufacture a lot of this stuff, but India could manufacture a lot of it and send those things and set up export markets and claim big chunks of those markets, internationally, even if competing with China is not easy on that front.
Right. When you were traveling through India, did you find, I mean, I guess I know the policy landscape, but did you find any momentum around decentralized renewable energy? Did you find people excited, not excited? You travel all over the country, so I'm just curious, is it all about big systems, or is there still scope for decentralized renewable energy in India?
So yeah, so I did this trip in what, 2020, 2022. I initially planned to go in 2021. I had to delay it a year because of the horrible COVID, Delta wave that hit India. I got there in 2022. There was a lot of decentralized stuff going on in India, and you could find it, and it was going, but still, then much of the discussion revolved around big utility scale renewables, big grid things. I told you I went to Manipur. I went out to a little village up in the hills there that had just been finally brought electricity, I think in 2019, I believe it was, they got it. And that was grid delivered, right? The definition of getting electricity was we were connecting you up to the larger grid. Now, of course, the days I was there underscored the challenges. They had no electricity the 2 days I was there because it wasn't working. And that's, one of the big issues is although India's solved, I think, in many ways, the basic access issues, so many people have been brought on, hundreds of millions. Just in the 4 years I was in India, hundreds of millions of people were brought into the electrical system. That meant being connected to the grid largely. But you could see the drawbacks to some of that when you got to the village. And of course, they didn't have any electricity for those 2 days because the grid wasn't delivering it to them. I think my sense is that discussions changed quite a bit. There's a lot more that the feasibility and the workability and the investment finance is now there to really make big strides with decentralized electricity systems, and that those are really making big progress. I know, for example, the initial solar goals that India set, they sort of were a runaway success at the utility scale level. They were kind of a complete failure at the rooftop level. But I think there's new efforts now to get a lot of that distributed and rooftop solar out there, and going. And I think and again, the technologies are much less expensive, much more available, and much easier to use. Just look at India's neighbor Pakistan and what's happened there with the absolute flood of solar that's just being imported by individuals and small businesses, and they're just literally throwing them up on their lawns, on their balconies, on their roofs, and plugging them into a socket, and they've got electricity. In some ways, that's a disaster for the grid, but it shows that the solutions are there. And I think that decentralized aspect is I mean, I'd love to go back and really look at it in great seriousness, because I think it's much more serious today than it was even 3 years, 4 years ago.
Excellent. My final question, Bill, is like, are you going back to India? Are you going to do more reporting? Are you going to write a book? Or what's your next plans on covering India's energy transition?
Well, I would love to go back to India. I don't have any immediate plans, but I assure you I will be trying to figure out a way to get back there. Because again, I still think it is in some ways the critical country for the next big leg of the global energy transition, right? We've seen all this progress. If you kind of look at it, like a lot of these technologies were invented in the US back in the 60s and got a boost in the 70s. Lithium batteries and solar panels, and a lot of it was invented in the US. China then picked it up, has gone like gangbusters in terms of driving the cost down, manufacturing at massive scale, and implementing it within China, and now to some extent exporting it. But I think the next leg really is India, because it's such a big country that's going to account for so much of the growth in energy demand over the next 50 years. And it's so dependent on coal. So if we're going to make climate progress, we're going to have to start eating away at that coal challenge. In some ways, China is, I think, given a bit of a path there to sort of, we'll see what happens in China. But, the plan seems to be, let's build out a lot of coal capacity, but let's not necessarily feel like we have to use it all, and eventually kind of put it into a kind of peaker and support role, which takes a lot of work and a lot of investment in and of itself. But then, eventually sort of scale it back within the system. We'll see whether it happens in China, but I think that's probably a manageable and the only real manageable way forward for India is to try to pull that off. And I think that's possible. You've still got a lot of coal capacity being added to the system. The amount of coal generation doesn't seem to be structurally rising too fast. I think it actually may have dipped or plateaued even in the last year or two. I think you're right that you're going to see an uptick now with the Gulf situation. But longer term, again, renewable energy, especially once you get these grid upgrades, it just is so much cheaper than building new coal. It's hard to believe that new coal plants are going to be built. And over time, it's really going to be cheaper to even just operate at an operating level day to day. It's going to be cheaper to be running these renewable energy facilities rather than burning coal, and they'll coal hopefully be pushed down the system. We'll see what happens.
Thank you so much. This was such a treat to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Really enjoyed doing it.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow @DIEH Podcast and get in touch with the two hosts, @Shreyajay and @Sandeep Pai. Thank you for tuning in. Join us again for our next episode.